Okay, well, welcome back. We're moving on to chapter 8. When we last left off, what was happening was they worked, Carmen and Justin worked with Max, and Mom had come home and she was amazed at what she was seeing. And unfortunately, Mom asked if anybody wanted to stay for dinner, and turns out Chu understood and read the body language and said no thanks. But Carmen said, thanks, Miss Wincott. I'd be glad to. So that's kind of where we left off. So chapter 9, here we go. Justin couldn't make eye contact with Carmen. This was the most awkward dinner ever. No one spoke. The room was silent except for the scraping of knives and forks against plates. Justin couldn't help but think of Max all alone in the backyard while the rest of them sat together inside. He let his mind drift back to their training session. Max had gotten even better by the end of the day, jogging alongside Justin in circles around the yard. When he'd fed Max dinner, the dog had happily scarfed it down. He worked up quite an appetite today with all that exercise. At least someone was enjoying his dinner, Justin thought bitterly. Please pass the potatoes, his dad said from the head of the table without looking up. His mom cleared her throat from the other end. Justin handed the bowl to his dad, who scooped a chunk onto his plate. Justin chewed and took a slug of his soda. He held the bottle up and tilted it towards Carmen. She nodded, and he refilled her cup. Still, no one spoke. Justin stared at his food. It was so quiet that he heard the automatic ice maker in the freezer whirring and clicking, then dropping a load of ice cubes with a clatter. I'm sorry I burned the toast, his mom blurted out. I had it timed just perfectly, but when the phone rang and it was Mary, out of nowhere, she began to cry. Tears pooled in her eyes and threatened to spill down her cheeks as she spoke. And you know how Mary can just go on and on. Her voice cracked and she put her head in her hands. Justin considered crawling under the table, but he thought that might make things even worse for Carmen. He was used to his mom acting this way since Kyle had died, but his new friend shouldn't have to suffer through it. He swallowed hard, raised his head, and snuck a glance across the table. Carmen was studying the food on her plate, looking as uncomfortable as Justin felt. I just lost track of time, his mom went on, choking down a sob, and I forgot I had it in the oven, she trailed off. His dad gave her an understanding look and reached across the table to reassure her, but his mom pulled her hand away and shook her head. Carmen looked up and met Justin's eyes. She shot him a worried look. Are we having fun yet? Justin mouthed to her. She shook her head at him as if to say, show some respect. She sat up straighter in her chair and took a bite of her food. This is delicious, Mrs. Wincott, Carmen said with a smile. Oh, his mom said, sounding surprised and grateful for the shift in the conversation. She dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. Thank you. She put her hands in her lap, collecting herself. Justin realized that Carmen wasn't just good with dogs. She was an expert with people, too. His mom smiled at Carmen. We lost our oldest son recently, she said apologetically. Yes, ma'am, I heard. I'm sorry. So, Carmen, Justin's mom said, trying to change the subject, how do you know so much about dogs? My father used to raise pit bulls, and my brother trains them. There was a note of pride in Carmen's voice. Justin's dad leaned toward Carmen. You know, dogfighting is illegal in Texas, he said. Carmen's eyes got big with shock. Justin and his mom held their breath. His dad could be hard on Justin, but he usually was polite to guests. There was a note of a challenge in his voice and that Justin had never heard before. Then, again, Justin had never brought a girl home for dinner, so there was that. My brother rescues dogs, Carmen said evenly to Raymond. People get pit bulls when they're little and cute. Then the pits get big and people don't want them anymore, but no one will adopt them. So their owners just put them out on the streets. My brother takes them in, trains them, and adopts them out. Justin turned away so his dad wouldn't see him smile. Carmen had totally owned him. She kicked Justin under the table. Carmen spent the afternoon showing Justin how to work with Max, his mom added. You should see how well Max is. Before she could finish, Max started barking ferociously in the backyard, as if on cue. Is that right? His dad said sarcastically. Justin's heart sank. Max hadn't done his crazy barking all day. He'd been perfect. But his dad hadn't been around to see it. Justin's mom looked so disappointed. They both knew that if his dad didn't come around to trusting Max, the dog was a goner. After making such great progress that day, it looked as if they were back to square one. Then the doorbell rang. Everyone exchanged glances across the table until finally his mom laughed. Max had been barking for a reason. He had heard someone approaching the house before they did and wanted to warn his new pack. Justin's mom shot his dad a "I told you so" look, and Justin and Carmen grinned and exchanged a look of relief across the table. The doorbell rang again, and Justin hopped up to get it. He was glad to have an excuse to get away. Justin swung open the door. The sound of the evening cicadas washed over him as he took in the familiar, if unexpected, figure in the doorway, Tyler Harney, his brother's best friend. Justin was so shocked he couldn't speak. Wasn't Tyler still in Afghanistan? Tyler's hair was cut short, military style, but he wore regular clothes, jeans and a collared shirt. He carried a bouquet of flowers wilting in the evening heat. Look at you, Tyler said quietly, flashing his teeth. Same little slacker. I remember only with a few more zits now. Justin just stared at him. The last time he'd seen Tyler, he was with Kyle on the other end of a video connection from thousands of miles away. In fact, every time he'd seen Tyler, Kyle was right there by his side. The two had been inseparable since they were kids. Now Tyler was here on their stoop alone. You gonna let me in, champ? Tyler asked, his smile tight. Justin stepped aside without a word. Tyler moved past him into the house where his mom and dad looked at Tyler with stunned expressions on their faces. His mom's eyes filled with tears, and her hand shot up to cover her mouth. I hope it's okay that I came by like this, Tyler said. I've been home for a couple of days now, and he trailed off and held the flowers out to Justin's mom. Tyler, she said, stretching out her arms for a hug, it's so good to see you. Tyler hugged her back. Mrs. W., I wanted to tell you how sorry I am about... Oh, hush, Justin's mom said into his shoulder. I know. Let's not talk about that now. We've had enough waterworks here today. She happily looked him up and down as if to make sure he was really there. Didn't expect to see you back so soon, Justin's dad said, limping forward and squeezing Tyler's hand in a firm shake. Medical discharge, sir. I took shrapnel all up and down my back and got a few pieces lodged in my spine. He looked down at the carpet, then back up at Justin's dad. Guess I'll be carrying these little souvenirs around for the rest of my life. Something about the way Tyler spoke to his dad rubbed Justin the wrong way, but his mom looked so excited to see him that he pushed the feeling aside. Justin had never really been that crazy about Tyler, even though he'd practically grown up with him. Tyler had spent more time at Kyle and Justin's house than he had at his own. He was just always around. Justin's parents loved Tyler, but Justin had never quite trusted him. Tyler had always been the kind of a kid who acted one way when someone's parents were in the room and another way when the door shut behind them. He was extra polite when Justin's mom or dad was around, telling them that he and Kyle had done their homework and that they would help Justin with his. But Tyler never so much as explained a single math problem to Justin. Instead, when it was just the boys, he would try to mess with him. Tyler would make fun of Justin, calling him a serious loser or a computer nerd. The worst part was that Kyle would laugh and punch Tyler on the shoulder to tell him to lay off Justin. But if Kyle left the room, Tyler would keep on giving Justin a hard time. Right now, though, that was the last thing Justin's parents cared about. What did it matter anymore anyway? Without Kyle here, Tyler wouldn't really be a part of their lives. Well, Justin's dad said to Tyler, aren't we just a couple of beat-up old Marines? Tyler nodded, his face serious. Yes, sir, Mr. Wincott. Proud to stand alongside you. You came back just in time for the 4th of July parade, his dad said. I'll be proud to have you march alongside me, too. Justin resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Oh, no, sir. Tyler held his hand out in front of him. You know me. That's not my scene. You'll be right there with me, Tyler, Justin's dad said in a firm voice, marching by my side. His dad broke into a smile. Do I make myself clear, Marine? Yes, sir. Tyler raised his hand in a salute. Justin couldn't help it. He actually rolled his eyes this time. Does it hurt? Justin was surprised by the sound of Carmen's voice. She was still sitting at the table watching the reunion. Tyler studied Carmen for a moment. All that metal in your back, Carmen finished. Yeah, it hurts, Tyler said. But they got me on so many painkillers, I hardly notice it. He eyed Carmen carefully. And you are? This is Carmen, his mom said, Justin's friend. She's been helping him with... She stopped mid-sentence, as if something had just occurred to her. Tyler, she said with a knowing look. There's someone else here I think you should say hello to. Tyler tipped his head to the side, confused. Who's that? Justin, do you want to show him? His mom asked. Justin shrugged and stepped toward the back door. Tyler and the others followed him. The group stepped into the darkness, and Justin heard Max's chain jangle as the dog stood up and crossed toward them. Justin's eyes adjusted to the dark, and he saw Max straining against his collar and sniffing at the air. Suddenly, he lurched forward, his eyes bulging out of his head and his ears tucked back. He started growling and barking ferociously, baring his teeth. The fur on his back stood up, and he dug at the grass with his paws. Justin gave Carmen a worried look. She shrugged in confusion. Max? Huh? Tyler said, shaking his head. He had a strange expression on his face that Justin couldn't quite identify. I heard they were gonna, put him down, Tyler went on. He looked at Justin's parents. Well, he's alive, I see. Max strained even harder against his collar, practically choking himself. Justin's mom looked at her son with a concerned expression. He shook his head helplessly. Max had made such great progress earlier. Justin hadn't expected this. Why would Max hate Tyler? He knew Tyler. Hey, boy, Tyler said nervously to Max. There's no Hodjas here around here. You don't have to get so worked up. We're back in Texas now. Max just flipped out harder at the sound of Tyler's voice. His barking had taken off on a mad, frenzied tone. Justin was worried that he was about to get loose from his chain. Suddenly, with a huge tug, Max bolted forward and pulled the stake right out of the ground, his eyes glowing with rage. Max lunged at Tyler, ready to rip Tyler's throat out. Tyler barely had time to take a step backwards and cover his face with his hands. Before he knew what he was doing, Justin threw himself in Max's path. Stay! Justin screamed. Max skidded to a stop, but kept his eyes on Tyler and let out a low, angry growl. He crouched down as if he were going to leap at Tyler again. Carmen reached out and grabbed Max by his choke collar. Stay, Max, stay, she commanded. Justin stood close to her and grasped Max's collar too. Together they managed to subdue him. Tyler raised his hands in the air, shaking off the encounter. Justin's mom held both hands over her mouth. His dad threw open the back door. Let's go inside, Pam, Justin's dad said sternly. Without a word, his mom grabbed Tyler by the arm and led him inside. As Tyler took one look over his shoulder at Max, Justin saw something surprising in Tyler's eyes. He would have expected Tyler to look afraid or maybe relieved, but instead he just looked something else. For a second, Justin couldn't name it exactly, but when he realized what it was, Tyler looked angry. And that's the end of chapter 9.